Hey, we have yet another Ask Us Anything session today. And the general subject is about microservices, around microservices. If that becomes boring, you can ask anything else. So start typing your questions, especially since we have a great guest today with us, whose name I'm not sure how to pronounce, so I will let him introduce himself. He's going to help us answer all your questions today. So, is it Micha or Micha? Not sure. Sure. Audio problems. That's the problem with technology. Nothing works from the first attempt, which is normal, again. So, as I said, we're going to answer all your questions around microservices or life, universe, and everything else. Start typing them. And as soon as the guest fixes his headphones, microphone, whatever the issue is, we can start, and you need to start typing. There we go.
Good to go.
I was just explaining how I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, whether it's Micha or Mika or...
It's Misha.
Misha.
And if you abbreviate that in a very Dutch aggressive fashion, you get Mies. And that's my nickname.
Mies.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So why don't you introduce yourself before we jump into questions?
Sure thing. So my name is Mies. I am the founder and CEO of Fiberplane. We're doing collaborative notebooks for DevOps and SREs to help them debug their infrastructure, resolve incidents in a collaborative manner. Before Fiberplane, I had another startup called Worker, which was a container native CI/CD platform that in 2017 got acquired by Oracle to bolster their cloud native strategy. And I'm also an angel investor in mostly sort of developer tools, infrastructure tools, creative tools companies through a fund called NP Hard Ventures.
There we go. We have the introduction. We know the subject. Let's go into questions and do our best to answer them. Speak on microservices on promotion stages from dev, NFR, I'm not sure what it is, staging, prod, environment. So how do we promote microservices from one place to another?
Well, we can do, of course, like blue-green strategies through CI/CD. I think it starts with CI/CD to sort of deploy your application to different environments. Spinnaker, I think, sort of in the cloud native landscape, is a good tool for that. I think that's sort of the go-to strategy, I would say.
The good thing that we got with containers, which we didn't have before, or that was much more complicated before, is immutability, right? So you can have reasonable guarantee that something you deploy to one environment is almost the same, if not the same, as you deploy to another, and so on and so forth, right? And that immutability can start from, infrastructure all the way until your application running as containers created from container images. And that's probably one of the biggest advancements we got, that immutability that trickles down from the very top all the way until bottom. And then it's really just about applying the same or small variations. Like, hey, if you have 3 replicas in staging, 1 replica in dev, and 10 replicas in production, it's not such a big difference. But what you have is going to be almost the same everywhere. And that's really what changes the game, at least compared to what we had before.
I would say on paper, right? Because along the way,
on paper,
mistakes can be made, right? Development dependencies can sort of be shipped inside of a container. I think the one unforeseen thing is always, which has nothing to do per se with sort of the container itself, but database migrations, right? You've changed your schema. Like, how does that reflect on maybe on staging versus production and all of that?
I'm also personally trying, when possible, it's not always possible or practical, but actually not to have like those environments like staging, dev, and things like that, but to create an environment for every feature, for every pull request, right? So instead of thinking like in the past when we were, hey, I have an application and then I have a development environment and I need to deploy it, and I need to make sure that I deploy it in specific order because my colleague might have another thing that he wants to put there and all that madness. Just create a pull request. And I'm simplifying it greatly. I know that real life is not that simple, but create a pull request, create a new environment for that pull request that will be as close to production, run it there, do whatever you need to do, and then you merge it to mainline and say, go to production. And I know that this is easier said than done.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I'm
I do think that's
sure that we should continue with static kind of, this is staging. Yeah,
I agree. I think I wouldn't say it's the holy grail, but like that's definitely something to aspire to, right? To have environments per pull request. I think there's still the challenge around you're building something, you're dependent on somebody else's work. How do these things sort of end up then in your sort of pull request environment? There's still multiple moving parts. So there's this sort of coordination that you need to get done. But then, I do think that the database stuff and like the traffic, that's still a challenge, right? Like usage on.
Oh yeah.
What happens to your feature or your pull request environment when like production data hits it?
Oh yeah.
Well, and I think if you're large, I think if you're large enough, you're gonna get into that issue, right? Like, how can you even mimic that data? I think, not sure if that's still true, but I know that back in the day, I think GitHub just used sort of production data to sort of test out new features.
Production data, like connected to production database, or production data like a copy of?
Actual data.
That poses its own challenges, kind of terabytes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to the next one. What, in your view, works better to develop microservices locally? Docker Compose or Kubernetes? Okay, let's split it into 2 questions. We'll go back to crossplane later, but Docker Compose or Kubernetes?
I have to say, internally, we do use sort of microkates or Minikube microkates. We also use products called tilt.dev to sort of spin up these environments locally. So we don't use Docker Compose, to be honest.
to me, I feel it's important that we reuse things. And to be honest, today, I understand in the past, if you go back from production and you already created a Helm chart or customizer or whatever you're using for production, I don't see a benefit not using that in development.
Yeah.
Why would you rewrite that stuff that you have to have into Docker Compose and as a result end with something very, very different?
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. Let's stick as close to, I would say, production as you can, right? Yeah.
Especially when that does not require much additional effort, because I don't see why is executing a command like Docker Compose up easier than Helm upgrade.
Yeah.
And going to the second question, can Crossplane create local clusters? No, at least not that I know. So you need to use something like K3D or Kind or Minikube or Docker Desktop or Rancher Desktop. Now, what I will throw into the mix is that I believe that maybe we're not there yet today, but I think that we are moving towards remote development. I see more and more value in creating virtual clusters, maybe, if not, or giving a namespace and saying, okay, so here's infrastructure. It's already configured. It has a service mesh and observability and everything you need. It's already there.
Yeah.
Here's a namespace for you or a virtual cluster. Use it.
And this would be during development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of your space in a shared infrastructure in a way.
Sure.
Because
yeah.
if you look at it from a certain perspective, if your workloads during development are going to run in a VM, doesn't make much of a difference for you as a person whether that VM is on your laptop or is somewhere else. It's remote. It's remote in any case, right? Remote doesn't feel like it's remote when it's on your laptop, but you are connecting to that VM in almost the same way as you're connecting to a remote cluster.
Yeah. By the way, have you tried any of the like, speaking of remote development, like the cloud IDEs, sort of the new I would say the new ones that
I tried them many times. I wanted to like them, but I always go back to my IDE on desktop. Kind of, I find myself much more productive, probably because browsers simply and shortcuts do not really work well for me.
Sure.
So I do tend to use, like, I use VS Code, but then I just have my namespace somewhere where I would work. And I would use Tilt or Octet or any of those tools to synchronize my code with that. So essentially, I think that I'm probably doing, give or take, the same what you described earlier, just not necessarily always local.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. But I do think with Tilt, and I think that's the way how we run some of our services. You can run specific services just on your laptop, so sort of outside the VM space. And then I think depending on, so I think like we do that, I think for the API, which is written in Rust. So, compilation faster on the sort of bare metal laptop versus inside of a VM. So that's something that we then kind of pull out. So, I mean, I do think there's still like a performance hit, right, when you do remote development.
Yes, there is a performance hit.
Yeah.
The problem with local development sometimes is depends how complicated your setup is. Sometimes is, hey, I need this and that deployment service ingress. I can do that.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter where I am, but then maybe my application is connecting with some other application to service mesh and then installing Istio locally. It's kind of...
Yeah, that gets messy. Yeah.
Anyways, let's go to the next one. Let's see what else do we have in the store. Hello, guys. What kind of workload is not fit to be deployed as microservices?
Some examples. It's a great question. Maybe all workloads, right? I think I think we always talk about microservices and try to, split up our architecture, but it does add additional complexity, right? But I think if you're just running a simple API and maybe a front end, you might not need microservices, right? If I look at our setup, we do have we kind of have like 3 backend services and then a front end service, and we've split these up. And occasionally, we get gripes from the engineers that having everything in one repo would have been easier.
I usually people associate microservices with size, like it needs to be something micro.
Yeah.
My definition of microservice is something that can be managed by a single team.
Yeah.
That can be deployed independently of the work of other teams, and that has the need to be scaled independently, right?
Yeah.
Now,
It's like a logical unit of work.
Exactly.
Yeah,
now,
so,
whether that's 100 lines or 10,000 lines, it's more important to me that we do not stumble upon each other. I'm doing something, and then I need to wait for you to do something else for me to continue my work or deploy it or what's or not.
Yeah. So what I've seen I'd worked at a previous company. We definitely had sort of our obviously like our pipeline infrastructure that would run the CI/CD job, and then we had the front end, so these was kind of like separated. But like one of the first thing that we really pulled out as a microservice was, and I think that's also a great way to start, is identity. So off and then off Z. I think that's a great starting point, like to pull that out of your code base and deliver that as a separate microservice.
Okay, so the short answer to the previous question depends.
It depends, always. Yeah.
Exactly. How do you make sure to have stable interfaces between microservices when you want to move fast with new features?
That's a good one.
It's a tough one.
Yes. So back in the day, what we did, so this was again for Worker, what we did, we actually had a thing called Blueprint, which was sort of effectively the blueprint, the template to start a new microservice. And it was built using gRPC and protobuf. So that would be the protocol buffers would be the way to sort of set up the interface between services, right? Like what you expose and what you would like to receive. So I think that's a common interface definition is the way to go.
I see those interfaces almost like a language, right?
Yeah.
We need to agree on what we're talking about and in which language we communicate. And if there is one rule I think should be applied to systems in general, especially microservices, those interfaces are sacred. You can change it, but you cannot randomly just change. For me, it would be so beneficial to add this or remove that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point, right? I think you can settle on the format, right? Be it protocol buffers or like JSON, RPC, or just HTTP. But indeed, if something gets changed on one or the other ends, and you don't tell your teammates, things get messy.
Yeah,
they're quite sacred. Yeah.
That would be equivalent of having a class. I don't know. Let's say you're working with Java. You have a class that accepts certain parameters, and then you just randomly change it without refactoring the rest of the code, kind of like.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely argue, of course, the benefit of like using something like protocol buffers. It is a separate language. It is a language on its own. It's it's defined in the .proto file. You can obviously have some guardrails around, hey, if that thing gets changed somewhere, something's up, right? Like, and everybody should know.
Exactly.
Versus just changing your code, like changing your code base, right? Like then that's less transparent, I would say.
Okay. From Chandley, as a DevOps cloud engineer, should you need to know how to refactor monolithic code? If not, what are the tasks that could be related to microservices in those specific roles? Now I will leave that to you because I'm never sure what a role really means, because being DevOps or cloud engineer or any other role can vary so much from one organization to another.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the main question, like, do you write code as a DevOps engineer?
If not, should you have dev in DevOps?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, without going into specific roles, right? This type of engineer, that type of engineer, somebody needs to know how to refactor monolithic code if you're going to move away from monoliths, which I'm not saying that you have to. So somebody does. Now, whether that's you or somebody else, I do not know.
Yeah.
And apart from that, the more services you have in your system, more you need to think about, okay, so how will networking be between those? How will communication between those work? How can we deploy things without breaking compatibility so that the rest of the system continues operating as usual? So there's a lot of additional burden on the operational side. The bigger the system is, the more components there are in a system.
Yeah. But I think
somebody needs to know that.
Yeah, but I think if you do indeed write code, you should probably know or be aware like which parts of the code can be pulled out and to refactor indeed. You know, so that we spoke about maybe the identity and the authentication and the authorization layer as a good first piece of code that you can pull out and turn into its own services. And then once you've done that, yeah, indeed, all the questions around what are the interfaces, how are you thinking about networking between the different components.
What's next? From Andres, what is the dream stack with Kubernetes for you? I know the one tool that is part of your dream stack. What are the others? I meant Fiberplane.
Yeah.
Apart from Fiberplane.
The dream stack for Kubernetes. Well, one, I'm a big fan of the fact, like a managed service, right? So be it AWS or Google Cloud, or the Microsoft Azure one. I think it being managed for you is a great benefit. So I would go down that path. Of course, Fiberplane for exploring your observability data. You of course need to observe your system in the first place, so you need something around metrics, and Prometheus is the sort of de facto choice, I would say, for exposing or instrumenting your code and then capturing those metrics. You need something around logs. Do you have a favorite logging stack?
Yeah, I would add Loki to the mix for logging. When we're talking about observability, and probably to finish the picture, either Jaeger or Grafana Tempo for traces. Then you have more or less observability in place. I mean, some dashboards, Grafana maybe.
Yeah. I think like CI/CD, like getting your app on there is a big question mark for me.
To me, I'm with you when you said managed services. So I love GitHub Actions. I don't want to.
We use GitHub Actions.
I think that Tekton is amazing. I think that Argo Workflows is amazing, but I do not want to manage more things than I have to. GitHub Actions do the work, right? And it's run by somebody else.
I think
depends how far you want to go.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, you are writing some kind of YAML around getting your deployment files in a good spot, right? In order to templatize that.
In that aspect, I'm a customized person. I know that majority of people prefer Helm. You need GitOps, Argo CD, or Flux. Yeah. It's a never-ending list. Now we can probably say, hey, you need Service Mesh. Maybe at some later stage.
Yeah, we don't use a service
You
mesh.
need, huh?
We don't use a service mesh right now.
Yeah, but that's actually good. One problem with Kubernetes, and I think that this goes back to the conversation we had before we started the show. It's too big of a landscape, and people very often enter into the trap that I need everything. And once you start needing everything, once you start thinking that you need everything and you implement everything, you're in for a huge mess. I think the service mesh is great, but I always advise people only up when you need it. When you figure out that there is a feature that is absolutely necessary, and then you use service mesh. Like we mentioned earlier, blue-green deployments or progressive delivery of any other sorts, like canary deployments. Hey, service mesh is great for that. If you're not doing it, do you really want to expand the complexity of your system and the difficulty of debugging issue in your system by having too many things?
Yeah. I would add one sort of tool in the mix, and I'm cheating a bit because it's a tool that we internally developed. But so for us, we do have some kind of microservice architecture with like API, the front end, and some other bits. So we have an internal tool called FPX, which helps you sort of cut a release of the entire system, creates a notebook for you in Fiberplane, of course. That sort of is your run book to make sure like all the things get correctly deployed. So some automation as the interface, I would say, sort of between GitHub Actions and Kubernetes.
There you go. What is a good documentation model or method for microservices applications? Before you answer, I doubt that it's really specific to microservices, right?
What's
whatever the answer is.
Yeah.
I don't want to answer because my answer is always marked down in a Git repo.
Yeah, I think, well, coming back to the previous question on sort of interfaces, I definitely think you need, to document the interfaces between your services in a good way, right? So, make sure that your proto files, if you're using gRPC and protocol buffers, in a specific spot, and like have them be documented in some central place. Could be marked down inside of GitHub. We of course use Fiberplane as a documentation tool.
What else do we have? Hey, Alexandru. Oh, I don't have the answer to this one. Tilt versus scaffold versus Octeto. I do round robin between those three all the time.
I just looked at scaffold, and then we ended up with Tilt, but I haven't used or looked into Octeto.
I have a feeling that scaffold is not under heavy development anymore, and that Tilt gives you scaffold. Tilt is like scaffold on steroids with better user experience. That's how I would describe it.
I think that went to Docker, right? Tilt, or
yes,
whatever the company behind Docker is now. It went
exactly
that way.
They were acquired maybe half a year ago, half a year, I think. Yeah. And Octeto is also great. Both of them do the similar thing. Like, hey, this is the code on my laptop. I want it to be synchronized in wherever I'm running my application, and then also help with starting that application in the first place and things like that. Yeah. So don't use scaffold. I think it's old and maybe not under heavy maintenance. Choose between Octeto and Tilt. That's what I would say.
Yeah. I think one thing already I think is kind of interesting from this conversation is like we've talked about a lot of tools already and implications of microservices and sort of cloud native architecture. And we spoke about this a bit earlier before we began, but I think the landscape of stuff to install and stuff to use has sort of exploded quite a bit.
Yes. I don't understand how people keep up keep being up to date. To me, it's,
Yeah.
I'm completely lost. I wake up in the morning and kind of get depressed. And if somebody sends me a link to CNCF, then I want to open a window and jump.
Yeah, I mean, we're 30 minutes in the show, and we've gone from local development, interface definition language to monitoring and observability.
And it's still scratching the surface. What metrics do you use to scale microservices in Kubernetes?
Yeah, I'm gonna give a biased answer to this one. So we actually started a open source project called Autometrics. Right now, support for the Rust programming language and TypeScript. And the whole goal is to actually make metrics easy and fun to use. So I think the challenge with metrics is that you actually need to write a lot of code. You need to instrument your code in order to get the metrics out of it. And that's not fun. It's like writing unit tests. You need to do work to do the work. And Autometrics helps you with that. So check that out on GitHub. And it's all Prometheus and OpenTelemetry compatible. So I let Autometrics write my metrics for me.
Exactly. I mean, there's still there is still the question of, we have metrics, right? Now, how do we pick which ones we're going to use to scale the application? I believe was scale.
Yeah.
And by default, Kubernetes comes with HPA, horizontal pod autoscaler, that scales in the past based on memory and CPU.
Yeah.
And while I think that that's necessary, I think that that's very insufficient or misleading, because your memory and CPU might not spike, and you might have still reach a point where your application is not very responsive, for example.
Yeah.
So probably the first thing I would look at is response times. Now, whether you get it from Prometheus or somewhere else, but response time is my first de facto choice.
Yeah. So and this is what Autometrics does for you. So it gives you error rate, response times, all the basics. Of course, if you want custom metrics, you can add that as well. But I agree, you want to sort of see the latency of your app first and foremost, and of course the error rate.
Where do you run databases? In cloud or on-prem? I guess that the question is really in cloud or self-managed. I would interpret the question.
Yeah.
Or managed or self-managed.
Yeah. Well, we do not manage our database. Jeff Bezos does that for us. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm on the same page with you. Database must be, if somebody would tell me you need to self-manage everything and you can choose only one thing that is going to be managed, that would be a database.
Yeah, I would agree. We can manage the application ourselves, I guess. But yeah, the database would be number one on the list.
Okay, what else? Could you talk about some projects that you have invested money recently?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. Yeah. So, interesting one for this discussion is a company called Flipped.io. And that is a open source and sort of cloud native feature flagging SDK and platform. So shout out to them. Another one would be SciScale, which is a security company. And then on the topic of, you don't want to manage your application and sort of deployment model, there's a company called Deta, DETA.sh, Deta.sh, and they are, that's a sort of platform as a service, a cloud where you can, run your app without all the headaches of Kubernetes. And now people will be upset because I don't mention, all the other companies. So
the list is too long, I think.
The list is too long.
A couple of hours.
Yeah.
How do you deal with developing microservices on Kubernetes locally when the architecture relies on some managed cloud services like
Yeah.
S3? Mocking or
Great.
development on a remote cluster?
That's a great question. There is a tool out there called Local Stack, and that can actually mock some of these cloud services for you. Not all of them, but definitely S3. Well, actually, yeah, they work locally, or can even work inside of a cloud IDE. But yeah, check out Local Stack.
Yeah, local stack solves it. Now, I
Yeah.
will give a slightly more generic answer that is not tied to S3. Big shift or a change that I think we've been experiencing in last, I don't know how many years, is decoupling those things from applications themselves, right? I don't think that, so the more of those things we move outside of the code application and leave application itself only deal with business logic and externalize all those things, the easier those problems are solved, right? You can use, for example, instead of hard coding or figuring out how your application talks, let's say with the message broker, you can use Dapper so that from application perspective, I speak with the broker and then I can configure it one way here and another way there, right? Same thing goes for networking, storage, right? You can say, hey, I don't, my application doesn't care about the storage. Storage is injected to me through the storage class. And then in this cluster, my storage class can be local file system.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you could, so we talked a little bit about sort of microservices templates and how do you standardize between teams, and I mentioned the blueprint project that we had with the first company, and indeed one of the it had sort of a plugin model where you could say, hey, it needs MongoDB as sort of the storage system, or it needs Postgres for the database layer, so you can sort of make that very pluggable within sort of your microservices template.
Exactly. So plug it, don't code it. Do you consider boilerplate heavy languages like Java less suitable for microservices, considering the amount of stuff required to do anything? I work with Go, so I'm probably not a good person to answer that question.
I mean, your answer would be then Java not a great language, perhaps? I don't know. I mean, Java's come a long way with things like Netty, sort of for building simple services.
It's more that I'm not using Java for a while now, so I don't know really where it is now.
Yeah.
But I don't think that I'm not, when working with different companies, I'm not seeing a huge difference in productivity based on whether some team is using one language or another. I don't think that that's so crucial there, right? Now, there are languages that are better suited for certain type of tasks. Like, hey, you're going to use some variation of JavaScript for frontend, unless we jump into WASM now. You want to use Go or Rust for something that is closer to the system. Machine learning would be Python, right? Yeah. But from the microservices perspective, I don't think it, I mean, yes, your application is Java, might require more memory than, let's say, Go, and might start faster. But of all the problems we're having, I don't think that languages are one of them.
No, I agree. Obviously, I don't think there's a huge gap in productivity in one or the other, because it usually also is dependent on the developer or the engineer, right? How proficient she is with the language. We ourselves use Rust. I do think for us initially, Rust had a steep learning curve, but now that we're sort of proficient with it, I think it's fine to develop microservices with it. I mean, I will say if you just want to start out with something, you could argue that something like Python, like a dynamic language, just easier to try things out. It's less strict than, for instance, the Rust programming language. But yeah, I think it needs to be your, sort of your own favorite tool of choice to get stuff done quickly.
What's next? Is Spring Boot still a good choice for microservices? I haven't used Java for many years now, so I have no idea.
I also have no idea.
What stage is best to use to manage TLS between microservices? What makes it the best? Any service mesh does that. Kind of that could be the reason to use service mesh if you want TLS between services. Now that gives you performance overhead, and I'm not really 100% convinced that it's such a big necessity to have internal TLS.
I agree.
Was the minimalistic dream stuck?
The minimalist dreams.
Heroku?
I was gonna say, still a great platform, right, to get stuff up and running quickly. We briefly talked about it, before the show. I think there's sort of this resurgence around platform as a service. So you've got companies like Fly.io and Railway, I think sort of on the containerized application stack. And then of course you've got Supabase and, Vercel more on the serverless type applications. Yeah.
But if somebody wants minimalist something, in my head, that's all. Those are the services you mentioned. Here's my container image, run it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
We're starting to have a lot of microservices, and we would like to offload rate limiting authentication to an API gateway and experience with Kubernetes native API gateways like Ambassador, Glue, Kong.
I haven't used any of these. So
I use them,
wouldn't
but
know.
it's not my main focus. So I had good experience with all three of them, but without really going into depth. No. I don't know. Suggestion for database with a lot of transactions and possibility to restore point in time. Isn't that going back to manage databases answer?
I mean, we use Postgres, but managed, so RDS on AWS. Have you tried this new one called Neon?
No, I haven't
Neon.tech.
tried it yet.
Sort of serverless Postgres, and they support branching as a feature, so that would help with sort of going back in time and all that. It's pretty cool thing to get started with.
And that's where Darin might jump in now, because we recorded recently a podcast. I haven't used it yet, about Planet Scale, which essentially gives you any scale database as a managed service with the ability to roll forward, roll back, and do all the fancy stuff.
So if it's done correctly with the Neon, like they kind of like decoupled compute and the storage system with Postgres. So if your app is not being used, they will sort of scale down the endpoint until it's waken up again. And then storage is in a separate system.
How to manage many microservices versions and deploy them for clients with different versions? Any tools? Should they be implemented as one package for client, or each microservice be deployed separately? I will let you answer. I'm just going to stick to the last part. I will argue that if each microservice is not deployable independently of others, it's not a microservice. I'm going to throw that one into there, kind of like. It's a distributed monolith.
It's a tough question. How to manage many microservice versions, deploy them. I think you need just a very excellent CI/CD setup and a very good understanding of your deploy matrix. And I don't know, like implement it as one package for client. I mean,
so I'm guessing that person is a sort of a vendor or something like that probably is delivering system to clients. That's where GitOps
I-
might help. You can just have a repo and say, okay, those are the specific versions of those microservices or services or whatever you have, and go. Whether now you apply that repository with specification through GitOps tools like Argo CD or Flux, or you use pipelines, or you do kubectl apply, you need to have a list of saying, this is an environment. Those are the exact versions and exact conditions of my system. It doesn't really matter whether it's microservices or not. You need that.
I mean, this is also maybe where like a service catalog could help, right? Like overview of what is running where in which environment, which version.
Exactly. Need to know what versions you have.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter whether you deploy them together or separately.
Yeah. Preferably not an Excel sheet.
Nor Google Docs or whatever, Google
exactly.
Sheet.
Or whatever, Google Sheet, yeah.
I have a question based on this example scenario. I have a service A and service B running in the same cluster. There is another cluster in a different region running the same services for HA. Say service A relies on service B, but service B isn't healthy. How can service A know how to fail over to service B in the other region? That's in a most basic variation. Those would be the health checks, right? And the load balancer or internal or external networking that says I'm going only to something that is healthy.
Yeah, I mean, preferably at the level of your cloud provider. Where
exactly
the request comes in, and it knows that one service isn't healthy. Yeah.
So health checks and a couple of rules. Do you think the developer experience has declined with the popularity of serverless?
Depends on which serverless, right? I think something like Vercel has a great developer experience, I would argue.
Exactly.
I think Cloudflare Workers has a pretty interesting model. Like I think they could improve on the DX of that, but that's they have very cool services that you can sort of use it with each other. If you go to sort of down the Lambda route, like pure Lambda, I would kind of agree with the statement that like, that's not a great experience, to be honest.
But then outside of AWS, whatever you just said, I think equally applies to other big players. Google Cloud Run is extremely simple and absolutely awesome. Here's a container image, run it. It scales it up and down and all those things. Azure has Azure Container Apps, again, same. What I'm not sure, and I don't know how you feel about it. So, no, before I ask the question, first, in my head, serverless is not only serverless functions, right? Serverless is much more than functions, right?
Sure.
And I'm not sure that functions are the way to go, except for special use cases, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair point. I think if you have a lot of functions, it does get complex, right? If you have a lot of functions and you need to sort of hook them up via an API gateway, it can get pretty complex, I would say. And I'm curious if you at that point might not be better off with, running managed Kubernetes.
Yeah, either managed Kubernetes or containers as a service, which would be many of those that we mentioned, which is still for serverless. I'm just not sure that there's something that is bugging me all the time with the model of one replica per request type of model. But serverless in terms like I do not need to think about servers. What's not to like about that?
Yeah, agreed.
What do you use to build container images inside Kubernetes? Canico, BuildKit, something else?
We don't build the images inside Kubernetes, so we just use GitHub Actions.
Yeah, if it's GitHub, I mean, if you're building through CI/CD,
Yeah.
And that CI/CD, these pipelines do not run in Kubernetes, then it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But if you do run in Kubernetes, then at least I'm personally on Kaneko.
Okay.
Okay, what's next? Hop, 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 hop.
That's all we have.
Maybe nothing. That's all we have. Okay. And we are close to the end.
Yeah.
Tell us, okay, before we leave, tell us about Fiberplane.
Yeah, sure thing. So, Fiberplane, you know, kind of got started from our frustrations, debugging Worker, right? So Worker was this CI/CD system, distributed architecture, and for us was always hard to debug like what's really going on. So back and forth between metrics, logs, traces, trying to figure out what's going on, and came to sort of several conclusions. One was you kind of need a sort of more explorative form factor to correlate these different types of data, right? So be it metrics, logs, or traces. So I think that's one thing. Then the other thing that I thought was just weird is how sort of we as developers have built all this collaborative software that we use day to day, right? So, be it Figma for design, Notion perhaps for, or Google Docs for productivity, Framer for building websites, but sort of we haven't really, as developers or specifically DevOps people, benefited from collaborative software, right? And then specifically, so for DevOps. So that was the other thing, hey, can we create this product that is able to fetch these different types of observability data or even DevOps data, right? Could also be data from your CI/CD system or your Kubernetes cluster, present that into one form factor where people can have a discussion or collaborate on it and sort of start building, infrastructure runbooks, interactive investigations, live documentation, all of that.
Brilliant. So, thank you all for watching. Thank you, Micha, for being with us. See you next time.
Pleasure. Yeah. See you next time. Thank you for having me.
Cheers, everyone.